Alrighty, let's get this started. Let's see. There's my face. How's everybody doing? Ready to learn some new React stuff? This is going to be pretty cool. React concurrent mode is the culmination of like 3 or 4 years of work for the React team, and it's not stable. It's not an actual stable release yet. But the React team this past week in Las Vegas at the React conference demoed this and put out an experimental release. So we're gonna experiment. Yeah. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we want to build. I'm gonna rename this here. React concurrent mode. All right, so this this right now is not using the latest concurrent mode stuff. It has suspense, the suspense component here, but this implementation is older and a little bit naive because we didn't have documentation. We didn't know what the final API was going to look like. So, Dan, how's it going? El Functino. But yeah, let's take a look at what we are trying to build. So we've got a shows app here that is just going to fetch different shows for us based on some search term, and it will return the shows and display those on here on the app for us. Psych is the default show because why not? It's Psych. So let's go ahead and close that. Well, we'll keep it open and maybe we'll close it later. All right, so so far, like I mentioned, this is kind of a naive approach because we didn't understand what concurrent mode would look like. So right now, shows view is has this search term state and a submit button or submit handler that gets passed down to the shows form. So when we type something in here, click submit, it's going to set a new search term, and then that search term gets passed down to ShowList. And then let's go look at ShowList. Actually, now that I think about it, I did set this up to not even use this suspense component. So yeah, this will be perfect. We can just delete this. It's not going to change anything. And now this looks like an app that we're pretty well used to. Until Code Sandbox freaks out on us. There we go. So we've got our show list, which is receiving search term as a prop, and it's going to pass search term into our fetch function. So inside our effect hook here, we're first going to set isLoading to true to indicate that we are loading some data. So if we do a search here, like Pokemon, you'll see our search loader indicator show up before we get our data back. So we set that to true. We await the API call. When we get that data back, we set that data to our show list state, and we set isLoading to false. So then we skip past our loader and we show our list of shows. So this is what we're pretty well used to, right? A component inside the rendering. Well, this component will start rendering. It will then fetch data, and while we're fetching data, we'll have this loading state. When that data comes back, then we render the data. And it's not even while that happens. we start rendering this component. We set is loading to true, and we render our loader, and then we start fetching our data. A good way to look at this, let me see if I can find what I just built here. Hold on one second. Okay, yeah, this one. This is the one I want. Okay, so it's kind of like this diagram here, right? So we've got our page load happens here. By the way, this is taken. The inspiration for this is taken from a talk from React conference this past week. So the page load starts here, and we've got two things that can happen with our code. We can, with our components. Our components can be rendering something, or it could be making a request. So when we load up our app, we download the code, and we start to render ShowList, but then realize that isLoading is going to be set to true. So instead we render our loading state. Once our loading state renders, then we come down here and we fetch our data. And this could take 300 milliseconds, this could take 3 seconds, this could take 30 seconds. Just depends on a lot of different factors. Once that comes back, then we come up here and we render ShowList. So this is what the React team calls as render then fetch situation. In fact, let's take a look at the, thanks for the follow. Appreciate it. Let's take a look at the React docs. I start typing React and it automatically goes to the hooks documentation. But let's go into concurrent mode. We're going to start here in suspense for data fetching. Scroll down a bit. Okay, so what we're talking about right now is traditional approaches versus what suspense actually does. Oh, that PNG is super tiny. I don't think I can get it much bigger because then it goes blurry. Maybe that's better. All right, so there are two kind of general approaches to fetching data for our components. We can fetch on render. So what we just saw, fetch inside a use effect. This goes like this, start rendering components. Each of these components may trigger data fetching in their effects and lifecycle methods. This approach often leads to waterfalls. So we started the upper level component and start rendering the next component, the child component, come down, start rendering the child component, come down, start rendering the final child component, and each one along the way has a use effect hook that's fetching some data. So we let the lowest component finish its fetch, then we come up, start the fetch for its parent, let that finish, come back up. That's kind of the waterfall approach. And this is kind of a hot word right now, so pay attention when you see people talking about the waterfall approach. It's what we're trying to avoid. Okay, then we have fetch then render. So this is, for example, like relay, but without suspense. So start fetching all the data for the next screen as early as possible. Makes sense. When the data is ready, then render the new screen. But we can't do anything until the data arrives. So both of these kind of have they're kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. they both have their own pros and cons. So enter concurrent mode, which gives us this approach, render as you fetch. So start fetching all the required data for the next screen as early as possible, and start rendering the new screen immediately before we get a network response. As data streams in, React tries rendering components that still need data until they're all ready. And I do have another, if I can find it. Another diagram. Okay, so let's open this one up. And we'll go larger there. Okay, so this approach kind of looks like this. We've got our page load that happens, and as our page loads, it needs to download the code. That's the first request it makes. It tries to render ShowList, but React recognizes that our component is not ready to render because we don't have the data. So we immediately begin fetching our data, and at the same time we're going to render our loading state. And then finally, when the data comes back, then we render our ShowList. So let's see if we can kind of throw these up side by side here. Obviously this approach with suspense and with concurrent mode makes a lot of sense, and up until now was impossible to achieve. You either had to render and then fetch data, or trade places with those, fetch data first and then render later. Concurrent mode gets its name because it is doing both of these things concurrently at the same time. We may come back to these, so let me slide this over and keep them handy over here. So again, what we're doing right now is this approach here, fetch on render. So let's talk about how we can start using concurrent mode in this application here. All right, so the first thing we need to do is actually grab the experimental release here for both React and React DOM. And let me share this here in the chat. Y'all can have this code sandbox too. You can play along with me. Okay, that's up in the chat. So go ahead and grab this code sandbox. You can code along with me, or just wait till I'm all finished and take a look at the finished product on from that link. Okay, so we've got the experimental release here for React and React DOM. Now we're going to come into our index, and you'll notice that this looks a little bit different than what we're used to. So we're used to importing React DOM from React DOM and calling React DOM.render and passing this in to the render function. But to experiment with concurrent mode, we have to have this create root function. We pass in the root element, and then we call .render off of that function call. So those are the two kind of setup steps you have to take. You gotta make sure that you have the correct experimental tags here, and then grab the create root function here. Okay, so now let's go back here and let's take a look at what we want to do to get away from this fetch on render waterfall approach and more into the concurrent mode. We're going to scroll down. Sorry for all the scrolling. Get down here to this approach. So again, in this approach, we're going to start fetching, we're going to start rendering, and then we're going to finish fetching. So let's take a look at this. First, we have this const resource being set up by this function. And then you'll notice in the children components that are actually rendering the data, they are calling that resource. So we've got this resource here. They're using that resource and calling a .read function off of that resource that was set up. And that's how they're getting the data for to render here. So let's go set up a resource. So we're going to do this. Let's see. Let's do this in our shows view. This is going to be the parent component, and we're going to do a couple things here. Set up our resource. Let's call this shows resource. Okay, we've got our const. Let's go look back here. Fetch profile data. What even is fetch profile data? We get a little hint up here. This is not a promise, even though it kind of sounds like a promise, right? This is a special object from our suspense integration. So this is resource is a special object from whatever library is going to be built to integrate with suspense. Right now, the only library that is released and ready to go with suspense is Relay. They've even got a couple custom hooks for helping with suspense. We're not set up with GraphQL. We're not going to use Relay. So we're going to go into, we're going to cheat. We're going to go into their code sandbox here. We're going to see where they imported it from. All right, so here is the resource. So fetch profile data is coming from fake API. So this is what we're going to do. I'm just going to come here, copy all of this, and we're going to rework this a little bit. We'll go through this line by line and take a look at what it's doing. And we're going to rework it a little bit inside our own API file here. All right, so we're not fetching profile data, we're fetching shows. We're not fetching multiple things, so we're not actually going to have this nested situation that they have here with resource.user.read. We're just going to call shows resource.read. So we're going to get rid of the nested part here and just bump our .read over to our resource. So instead of returning an object, we're going to just return whatever wrap promise returns once. And instead of user, of course, we're going to call this, nope, that would be if it was nested inside an object. We're just going to return whatever this passes in. Okay, user promise. Oh, looks like we did need one of these. So let's bring user promise back in here. Okay, stick with me. User promise gets whatever this function is calling. So let's change user promise to, is there any other, nope, shows promise. And let's go see what fetch user is doing. because that's what we're going to pass into here. So we're going to pass in a promise. So I'm assuming fetch user is the function that's actually going to return a promise because it's fetching some user. So return new promise. Yep, this one is just a fake API call from the docs. We're going to go ahead and get rid of this because we have a function, fetch shows by search term, that is going to replace fetch user. Okay, export async function. We don't need to export this. All right, so now we've got fetch shows by search term, which is async, so it's going to automatically return a promise for us. So now we have a promise. When we invoke fetch shows by search term, we get a promise, and we're going to pass that into wrap promise. You may have noticed that this has a search term parameter, and it's going to call whatever search term we plugged in. Let's just hard code psych in here for now, and not worry about that yet. We'll get to that in a minute, where we can pass something in here and make this dynamic again. Okay, so this is going to return a promise, and wherever we call fetch shows, which is going to be right here, and that was imported, good. Wherever we call fetch shows, shows resource is going to get what fetch shows returns. Fetch shows returns whatever wrap promise returns. So let's look at wrap promise. Now, one caveat, important caveat here. The suspense integrations like Relay implement a contract like this to integrate with React. Real implementations can be significantly more complex. Don't copy paste this into your project like we just did. So until we get something like maybe React Cache is a library that has been used for previous examples. Again, Relay is released, but until we get another library outside of GraphQL, then we're going to leave this here in the background, pretend that we didn't copy and paste it, and apologize later. Okay, so wrap promise takes in a promise. We set 3 variables here. So we have status is set to pending. We've got a result, and we've got a suspender. So suspender takes this promise and calls .then off of it. So when we first call fetch shows and we start our fetch, we pass that promise into wrap promise. Before this resolves, suspender is going to be that promise. So we come down here, then we return this read function. And the first thing this is going to do is it's going to say status right now before this resolves is pending. So we're going to throw our suspender. Now this is interesting. This is throwing a promise. There's got to be a good emoji for this. How about that one? What? So this line right here is throwing a promise, not an error. And this is what kind of runs or tells React if a child component needs to be suspended because it is waiting for some data. We'll talk about where this gets caught and how that works in a minute here. But let's go through the process while we're looking at wrap promise. So at first, when we first fire this all off, we're going to throw this promise, and React, it's the suspense component. will catch this promise. It will suspend rendering whichever component is fetching the data, and it will render the loading state. So that's how it knows to stop rendering the component that threw this promise, start fetching data, and while that data fetch is happening, render the loading state. Then when the promise resolves, if there's an error, then we throw the error. If the data fetch is successful, we return the result to wherever we call this read function. So we'll come back to this when we actually call .read. If you remember from here, .read gets called in our child component. So whichever component is calling .read, that's where we know, that's where the suspense component knows to suspend rendering that component. And when that data fetch resolves, that's how it knows to come back to this component, re-render, and if the call was successful, then we're going to return our data to whatever const we've set up here, and we can display that data. So let's make that actually work. We don't need fetch posts. That was part of the previous example. All right, so FetchShows is going to be called by shows view here. Is that right? We've got our resource happening outside of our components. And yeah, so now we need to set up our resource to read inside our child component. So let's actually notice how our parent component isn't actually using this resource. Let's move our resource to our child component, and we'll go ahead and call our .read from there. So let's get this out of here. And this is going to go into the component that's going to be rendering data. Okay, fetch shows. Can I just auto import? Nope, did not work. Oh, here we go. We're already importing this. So let's import fetch shows. Okay, now if we take a look at the example components here, you'll notice that there's no state. There's no if is loading, render this loader. That's going to be taken care of by suspense. Our state is going to be taken care of by our resource. So we can actually come into our app. Let me do this real quick. I'm going to comment all of that out so we can look at the difference later when we're done. We can come into our app. We can take out our ShowList state. That's going to come from our resource. Is loading is going to be taken care of by suspense. All this data fetch stuff is going to happen again inside our resource. Is loading is going to happen by suspense. We can actually go broop, deleted. Ha! Doesn't that feel good? Oh man. Okay, let me take a look. We're going to pause here real quick. I'm going to take a look at comments because we got some people commenting. Thank you. Let's see. Why do I get .js files after creating the app? I see so many templates with JSX. Yeah, most people probably use JSX. I don't know why I haven't for a long time. I have no excuse. Mostly because I work in Code Sandbox and not in a code editor anymore, so I don't need the code editor helps. So yeah, it is weird. They're interchangeable, but when I change, for example, app.js to app.jsx, I get an error when rendering. Okay, cool. Got that worked out. Awesome. React Async. Yeah, Dan suggested React Async. I think they are pretty... they say that they're suspense ready. I'm going to wait to see what the React team recommends, but we'll see. Don't copy and paste. Hey, you could have read it. Wasn't me. Interesting pattern. Good reminder, throw and return are very similar. One is meant to return errors, others meant to return data. Yes. Okay, so we just deleted a lot of our code. Here's our old component. Let's create, we have an error here, right? If we take that back out, we've got an error. ShowList is undefined, so let's create a variable for ShowList. And we're gonna get, again, we're gonna get this data from our resource.read. So we're gonna say shows resource .read, and that's where we're gonna get our data from. Let's see if this even works. May not work right now. Nope. Okay, we've got a couple problems going on here. One thing that we are going to have to start doing, that we have to get used to now, is going to do all the scrolling again. Sorry. We do need to handle errors with this. So we're going to add an error boundary class. And they currently have to be classes, so we're going to add this component and we're going to wrap it. You should be smart about where you wrap this. For the purpose of this example here, I'm just going to wrap it at a pretty high level. If you are curious on where and how and all the things about error boundaries, then just go check it out in the docs. They're explained here. Okay, so we've got our error boundary set up. Let's wrap our error boundary around, oh, we don't have it set up. There we go. Now we have it set up. Of course, import React, export the class, and let's wrap this. Let's go all the way to the top. App.js. Error boundary from /components /error boundary. Snippets, that's what I was looking for. Yeah, I only use .jsx for Emmet snippets. Haven't found a good way to have Emmet in .js. Yeah. Oh, I did not know that JS is the official recommendation. I often do things, I often do the right things on accident. And I often do the wrong things on accident as well. Okay, so we've got an error boundary. Now hopefully our cryptic errors here will not be so cryptic. So let's see what is going on. All right, so we've got an error here. React.create element. Oh, did I import it incorrectly? Yes, I did. Remember, it was a default export. Told you I do the wrong things on accident all the time. Okay, so React will try to recreate this componentry from scratch using the error boundary you provided. This is why it's a bad idea to just wrap your entire application. Oh, hey, we're back. This is why it's a bad idea to wrap your entire application in error boundary, because it will try to recreate the entire component tree. This is a really small app, so we're okay. Let's see if we refresh. Why is it working inside here, but not here? Let's see, are we in the same? Yeah, same component or same app. Across origin error was thrown. Nothing was returned from render. Oh, okay, I think I know why this is. So let's go take a look. All right, so is this going to actually work? No, we took out the search term. Why are you rendering? Ah, there we go. Okay, good. We have synchronized error states. Wait, no. That was the worst. Oh man. Okay. Let's just save everything, refresh this page. No. All right, let's talk about what's going on here, and I think we'll find where the error is happening. A lot of this stuff is going to be like the patterns we've used so far make sense. They follow the mental model that we know from building React, but we need to change that mental model a little bit. So let's talk about what is happening here. Let's pass in our search term, and let's make this happen so that when we call search term, no, how do we want to approach this? Yeah, let's do this. Okay, so we're going to take in our search term, we're going to pass it into read, because we want to be able to type in a search term, click the button, go search for something new, right? Clicking the button passes in a new search term to ShowList, which will re-render this component, which will trigger all of this to happen again. So let's pass this into read, and let's go to our FetchShows. So if read takes in a search term, well, we need our search term to come to be passed into here, and we need to make this dynamic based on our search term. Okay, we're going back through this way so I can show you the problem with our current mental model with React. Not that it's a problem, but it is a problem if we want to use concurrent mode. Okay, so we need all of this stuff here. We need to give all of that stuff access to search term, but we're receiving it inside here. So let's just take this. Let's see. If we call, how did I have this set up? I had this set up earlier until I fixed it, and now I don't remember the bad way of doing this. So we need to set up this promise down here. And, oh, not there. Let's see. We don't want that return. Okay. So now we have our promise, which we need for all of this stuff. So we're going to nest this down inside there, like so. Okay, and we'll just call this FetchShows, and we'll export this function. Okay, so now we've got a fetch shows, doesn't take in a promise. This is going to come from shows promise. There we go. Okay, so this makes sense now. When we call .read and we pass in a new search term, then we want all of this stuff to happen. We want to pass that search into our fetch shows by search term function. We're going to set up our promise. We're going to set up our suspender. We're going to throw our promise, and later we're going to return our result when we get our success. Okay, so that makes sense for this. When our component re-renders, we're going to refetch. But wait, that is what we were just told is what we call the waterfall approach, right? That's what we kind of want to not happen. So let's go scroll all the way back up, all the scrolling. So what I just described is fetch on render. We re-render ShowList because it gets a new search term. So calling ShowsResource.read, passing in our search term. So we render our component, then start our fetch. And fetch on render, let's see, it does not start fetching until after the component has rendered on the screen. This leads to the problem as known as a waterfall. So even though we just set up this resource and we're trying to use concurrent mode and suspense, we have accidentally, because of the mental model we have in creating components, we've accidentally found ourselves back in the fetch on render approach. So we kind of have to rethink and retrain ourselves to think about our components. We want this fetch to happen before we start rendering. So we're not even going to rely on search term here. When we type in a new search term, click the green button. That's the button click is what we want to trigger our API call, not this function re-rendering. So let's back out of where we got to, and we're just going to Command Z a whole bunch here. We'll go ahead and keep search term here. And we want to pass our search term into fetch shows, and then forward that on to fetch shows by search term. And then we want fetch shows, so we want fetch shows to happen first, and then we want to try rendering ShowList. All right, so we're okay to have just .read here. .read is not going to be the function call that kicks off our data fetch. Shows resource, or fetch shows, is going to be what kicks off our data fetch. But remember, fetch shows relies on search term to make all this happen, right? We pass that down to our fetch function that fetches our data based on our search term. Whew, that was a close one. Almost had one of those bugs that would be pretty hard to find. So .read is only going to throw our promise, throw our result, or return our result. Fetch shows is going to take in a search term. But even if we pass in our search term here, we would not have access to that search term up here. So this is where the mental model switch needs to happen. We're going to lift this data up a component. So we're going to get this out of here, and we can get rid of our import. We're going to lift it back up to the parent component where we had it before, where we were setting up our resource before. So we still don't have a search term here, but we are able to create a resource. So let's come down here. Let's look at the docs to see how we can do this. Scrolling. Okay, so they led us astray with this part, render as you fetch. So we're going to move on because this is the docs are really cool. They build from the most simple case to more and more complex cases. Our case is pretty complex, right? We're searching for data based on some search term that we have in an input and on a button click. Okay, so back to shows view, or back to the docs actually. Okay, we're still figuring this out. This is a good list to look at. Here's all the questions that the team is currently exploring and a lot of people in the community are going to be exploring. All right, so suspense and race conditions. This is where we kind of want to be. So let's come down here. So with the use effect, the child component again is fetching the data. That's what we had set up at the very beginning. But now with, so this is with classes. So the problem is this: React components have their own lifecycle. They may receive props or update state at any point in time. However, each asynchronous request also has its own lifecycle. It starts when we kick it off and finishes when we get a response. The difficulty we're experiencing is synchronizing several processes in time that affect each other. This is hard to think about. So let's talk about solving these problems with suspense. So we get back to our children components, what we saw above, where all they do is call that .read function to get the data. That's it. No if statement. You'll notice that we have user.name. That should throw an error, right, if we don't have user data. We're going to talk about that in a minute, why that is safe from cannot read property name of undefined. So we've got our children components that are calling the .read, and we've got the initial resource set up here. And look, they took this first call and they passed in an initial. The React team is suggesting that we fetch data first, set up a resource, an initial resource, and then inside the parent component, set up state with that initial resource. So let's take a look. So here's the parent component. We're going to have const resource and set resource is going to be some state that takes in an initial resource. So we're going to rename our shows resource to initial resource, and we're just going to pass in psych as the initial fetch. So we're going to before we ever notice that this is outside of the component. This fetch is going to happen before we even get to shows view to render shows view, before we even start rendering our show list component. So we're back to fetching our data first and then rendering while the data fetch is happening. So we fetch that data, and we're going to take this resource. Let's go look at the docs and see what we're going to do with resource. So resource is being passed down to the child component. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take this resource. We don't need search term, remember? ShowList does not rely on search term anymore, but we are going to pass down this resource. And ShowList is going to take in resource, and it's going to call resource.read to get the ShowList data that it needs. Or remember, if the data is not there, it's going .read is going to either throw a promise, which will suspend rendering, so we won't even touch this return. Or if the data has returned, then it's going to return the data to our variable here, and then we can render that. Okay, we're getting closer. This is exciting stuff. Interesting way to think about how to trigger our data fetch before we even start rendering our components. All right, so let's go back to the docs and let's see what's next. So we definitely want to add our suspense component here, and we're going to wrap that around the component that is calling .read. So we're going to say suspense. Oh. And suspense takes in a fallback. A fallback prop that is some kind of loading. We could just have a string here, some kind of loading message. So there's our fallback, and then our data. Whoa, we're back. Yes. Woo! It's working. It's working. Oh, don't want to save my page. Okay, we're at a working place. That's really, really good. Awesome. This is just from all the changes. Okay, so let's take a look at how we got to this point. In shows view, which is rendering show list and our shows form. So up here is our shows form. Well, here's our H1, right? And then we've got our shows form. And then all of these cards are show list. Thanks for the follow. Woo! I'm hoping to be able to do more live streams. My evenings have been taken up with family time, and that's been super fantastic. But hopefully soon I'll be able to get back into a regular streaming schedule. So thank you for following, because that should be happening soon. Okay, so we've got our show list rendering here. Now, when we go into show list, when React gets to this point here, it renders this component, it gets to this point here, it starts to render show list. Remember, before it started rendering, we've already kicked off our data fetch. So we get to this point here, we start rendering show list, but React realizes, because of this right here, this read function, which is throwing a promise, it realizes that we're still fetching data. And so instead of rendering ShowList, it renders the fallback, our loading state. So suspense here catches that promise that was thrown, checks to see if it knows that it was thrown from ShowList, checks to see if it is pending, resolved, whatever the status is. If it's pending, instead of rendering ShowList, it will render whatever our fallback is. So there's our fallback. When our data gets back, boom, it knows to watch that promise that it caught that was thrown by ShowList. When that promise resolves, React knows to come back and re-render, retry rendering ShowList. I say retry rendering because you could have multiple components nested in this component tree, inside this suspense component tree, that are fetching data, throwing promises. So every time something resolves, suspense is going to retry rendering again, and it will go deeper and deeper and continue rendering components as they finish loading their data. Super cool stuff. And I'm going to show you, well, probably not tonight, but another time soon, a really good way to handle that. All right, so ShowList, when the data comes back and we re-render ShowList, then we call .read again, and this time our status has changed to success. And so it's going to return the result rather than refetching our data and throwing a promise. It's just going to return to us whatever data was fetched. So that gets returned to here, ShowList, and then ShowList, we map over it and render show, this show component for every show that we fetched. All right, so now let's work on updating this list when we type in something here, because right now we don't have this wired up. So let's come back to shows view and our resource. Yeah, let's go look at it in the docs here. So we've got this SetResource function that when you can see it being called here, when we click on a button or when whatever action we want to trigger the next data fetch, we can call SetResource inside that action and inside that event. And then take a look at this. This is really cool. So here, when the next button is clicked, this app finds the next user ID and it calls this resource creator function again and passes in the next user ID. So initially, before rendering ever started, we fetched some profile data for profile 0 with the ID of 0. And that was our initial resource. That's what got passed down to these children components here. But then when we set up a new resource, when we call SetResource, and we change this resource to a different, we want to see the next profile, all we have to do is call this resource creator function again and pass in the whatever data we want. So let's go take a look at ours. FetchShows is, let's keep up with our notes here. Set up resource, set resource to state, pass down to component. On some event, handle submit, in our case, call set resource to set up a new resource and pass in our search term. Okay. So here inside our handle submit, when we click on this button, this is where we want to call SetResource. Ooh, but don't make this mistake. We don't want to just pass in our search term. We want to pass in the resource. Let's just do this. Let's say this. Call SetResource to create a new resource object. Okay, so we're going to call SetResource. We're going to create a new resource with FetchShows. And we're going to call FetchShows with our new search term, which is right here. Let's take a look at this search term state. It doesn't look, we're not using it anywhere. All we're doing is when we click handle submit, we set state for it. We don't actually need this. We're going to just take that away. Got our loading, load those. Now, let's try typing in Pokemon and clicking submit. Bam, there we go. Ha, it's so cool. So we've set our resource with a new resource. And let's go through the component lifecycle. Well, let's first do this. So remember, the goal is to not render first and then have that render trigger our data call. We want to kick off our data fetch as early as possible. So ShowList is needing data fetched. When we started, we were rendering based on ShowList, or we were fetching data based on when ShowList was rendering. So we would start rendering ShowList first. In fact, it would finish rendering, and then it would call this effect, right? These effects happen after the render. So we would render ShowList. We would call this API. We would set isLoading to true. That would set up our loader. Let's take this loader, by the way, and put it into our suspense fallback. That would trigger this, and we would wait for our data to come back, and then set isLoading to false and render our data. We don't want to do that. We don't want our data fetching relying on the rendering of ShowList. We want it to rely on this button click. We want to kick it off as early as possible. We'll let suspense recognize through that .read function that ShowList doesn't have the data it needs, and so it should render this fallback. So let's change this to our loader spinner guy. There we go. A little more fun there. So we're going to let suspense take care of when these children components should render. And it all depends on that .read. But the cool part about this is we're kicking off our data fetch from this function here when we click on the button, not when ShowList tries to render, right? I'm going to grab a drink real quick. Okay, still didn't help. So ShowList, when this starts to render, that's not what kicks off the data fetch. It's the button click. We set our resource, we pass our resource down to ShowList, and suspense takes care of, not that one. Where did our other one go? Suspense takes care of this concurrent stuff here. Man, it's so cool. We do have a bit of a problem though. So let's refresh here. We get our, I know, need to have a key prop. I forget that one all the time. We do have a problem. We're getting a warning here that says that shows view triggered a user blocking update that suspended. So the fix is to split the update into multiple parts, a user blocking update to provide immediate feedback, and another update that triggers the bulk of the changes. Refer to the documentation of use transition to learn how to implement this pattern. Okay, so this is interesting. What it's saying is shows view here. When we click this button, we are causing a user blocking update that's suspended. So we're triggering something that is going to stop our users from using our app, and that update got suspended. So the fix is to split the update into multiple parts, a user blocking update to provide immediate feedback. So we want a way to provide immediate feedback to our users, and another update that triggers the bulk of the changes. So we're going to go look at use transition to fix this. That actually comes in concurrent UI patterns, and the warning even tells us a little bit, does it say pattern? Yeah, how to implement this pattern. So this is a concurrent UI pattern that we're going to look at, and we're going to talk about transitions. So what are these transitions things? By the way, the reason we have to look at this is because of this. We've set this up to re-render when we click submit. And the problem is, if I click submit and then click submit again and again and again, or type in something new, it's going to cause some problems with our application. So we want to let our users know that they should not, that we're fetching data. We don't want them to keep clicking submit over here. Oh, we can get rid of that one. So we'll come here and read about transitions. So we'll see that when we click the next button in the example app here, not that example app, the one we were looking at before, down, well, they probably have the example here. So when we click the next button to switch the active profile, the existing page data immediately disappears, and we see the loading indicator for the whole page again. We can call this an undesirable loading state. It would be nice if we could skip it and wait for some content to load before transitioning to the new screen. It's a little different than the problem we had. Well, actually, that is kind of our problem too, huh? If we click submit, the whole page disappears, and then we get that loading indicator. So what we need is the use transition hook to help do this. It'd be nice if we could skip that transition and wait for some content to load before transitioning to the new screen. There's science behind science. There's been studies, yeah, that makes it science. They've studied it behind how if you immediately show this loading indicator, then your app actually feels a little bit slower than it is. And especially if your fetch happens a little bit quicker than what we've done. So we've actually told our app to wait 3 seconds before fetching our data. So what if this was just delayed for half a second? Let's see the difference here. Let me search for something else. We just get a quick flicker, kind of that janky transition from the spinner to our new page. Boom. We don't like that. That makes our app, first of all, that's what we would call a janky transition. Second of all, it makes our app feel slower than it actually is. So we'll come back and set this to 2 seconds. Okay, so how can we fix this? How can we skip that weird re-render and wait for some content to load before transitioning to a new screen? This is where the use transition hook comes in to help us. So we've done this part. Now we're going to import the use transition hook, where the action is taking place. So this handle submit, the submit handler. We're going to bring in use transition. Oh, I keep going to the wrong one. Then we're going to call use transition and pass in a config. And this use transition function returns a start transition function and an is pending boolean. So I'm just going to copy and paste that out of there and into our app. Okay, so we've got the use transition hook. We're passing in this configuration. Let's go read about that. Note we passed in the configuration object to use transition. Its timeout ms property specifies how long we're willing to wait for the transition to finish. By passing timeout ms3000, we say if the next profile takes more than 3 seconds to load, show the big spinner. But before that timeout, it's okay to keep showing the previous screen. Oh, so that sounds really cool, right? So if we say this is set for 3 seconds and our API call is only going to take 2 seconds, then we should actually never see that spinner. But of course, this isn't going to do anything yet. We actually need to use, see, by itself this code doesn't do anything yet. Told you. Well, so we need to use this start transition function and the is pending boolean. I might drop a couple more times, so we'll have to finish this up pretty quick here. We're almost done. So we're going to wrap our set state in a transition. So instead of just calling SetResource here, thank you for the follow. Woo! Tails is saying thank you. Instead of calling SetResource, just straight away on our button click, we're going to wrap that call inside our start transition. So we're going to take this set resource, we're going to wrap it inside start transition, which takes in a callback function and lets us do whatever our transition is inside there. Okay, so let's go check this out now. Now if we say Pokemon submit, oh, no spinner, boom, new data. Yes, it's awesome. I think those are just errors from our last. Yeah, no spinner. Oh, we're not going to see it update because it's the same stuff. Psych. no spinner. There's our data. But we somehow need to tell our users that we're loading data, right? That's where the isPending Boolean comes in. So isPending, as I'm sure you can imagine, it's React telling us whether the transition is ongoing at the moment. So let's take isPending, let's pass it down to our form. And we'll take isPending. We'll go into our shows form and we'll disable our button. Oh, let's pass isPending in up here as a prop. We'll disable our button if a call is pending, and we'll even say, what do they have here? Adding a pending indicator. We'll just say this next to our button. There's probably better ways to handle this. I personally like spinners inside the button. But for now, we'll just say if our search is pending, then we'll have a loading text right here. So we'll call Pokemon loading. This button doesn't do anything different for disabled, but you saw the loading indicator here. So let's watch this user experience. We click on the button, we immediately get this loading message, not a huge janky spinner. If our users are on a really fast network, then they'll just get their data basically right away. Boom. We didn't have that janky spinner in front of our face. If they're on a really slow network, so let's say it takes 5 seconds to load data. Loading. And then we search for something new. We get a loading indicator. 3 seconds later, we'll show them that we're still loading. Oh, it worked. That should not have happened. Don't you love that? Oh, man. That might be a bug. I don't know why that would have happened. Timeout 3 seconds. So if we make our API responses to takes 5 seconds, which we just did, we can now confirm that now React gives up and transitions anyway to the next screen after 3 seconds. This is because we passed timeout 3 seconds. Yeah, it seems like it should wait. It should show us the fallback. There we go. Okay. Maybe Code Sandbox just hadn't caught up to us. And all right, when all of this was first demoed in the Iceland JS talk, April 2018, so over a year and a half ago, all of this was demoed, and it was amazing. I'm not kidding. The week leading up to that talk, I was sitting down with our UX designer, and we were trying to figure out how to give our users this exact experience. And I spent the week building all of this out in React 15. I think React 16 had come out by then, but without suspense for data fetching. And so I had been working on these loading states, these loading indicators, not showing a loading indicator for like 800 milliseconds, maybe 1 second, a second and a half. I had been trying to solve this exact problem, and it was really, really tough in regular React. And now, look how easy it is. We just wrap that we're starting a transition. We tell our transition how long to wait. We wrap suspense around ShowList. ShowList is now this instead of this. So with all of that super simple code, look at this user experience we get. We're loading some data. All right, this is taking a while. We'll go ahead and show the spinner. Maybe not. Now it's all broken. Anyways, when it was working, it was a wonderful experience. That's as far as we're going to get to today, but there's so much more to this. This is a fairly common, somewhat more complicated use case for data fetching, right? But it definitely gets more complicated. So the docs do go through a lot more of those cases. Let's see. Transitions are everywhere. So still talking about transitions. Baking transitions into the design system. So talks about creating a custom button component so that you don't have to do this everywhere. You just have in our form, we would use our button component instead of this button to handle our transition. So we can bake it into our design system. Talks about the different steps, talks about why this is a better experience. Usually we do this and it feels like we've taken a step back before we complete, whereas we should be doing this, which feels like a step forward. Let's see. What else is there? Delaying a pending indicator. It's crazy. Yeah, other patterns. Splitting high and low priority state. What else do we have? Deferring a value. I mean, there's so much more that this gets into. And it even gets into how, maybe it wasn't this, maybe it was, suspense list. Yeah, here we go. So if you've got multiple components that have their own suspense, so there's going to be some different designs that you'll adopt. You could wrap suspense around profile trivia and profile timeline, and then neither will render until both have finished fetching, or you can wrap them in their own suspense. And so if profile trivia fetches its data first, it will render while this is still loading, and then this will render. So these will render when their own data fetches finish. But what if you want to guarantee that profile timeline renders first? Even if profile trivia's data comes back first, you can wrap it in a suspend list like this, suspense list. And the reveal order, it will reveal this forward. So it'll go top to bottom. It will reveal first profile timeline and profile trivia, always, even if profile trivia finishes fetching its data first. You can do backwards, so you could do it backwards or together, which again you could just wrap it in its own suspense to do it together. Yeah, a ton more to learn about this, but hopefully that was a good look at where we're headed. We just need a couple things that we need to, before this is all ready, we need a library. React Async, I think Dan mentioned, React Cache are a couple that are Relay's already implemented this. We need a couple libraries to implement this creator. We need them to implement this creator function, resource creator function. Also, as we looked at this a little bit ago, sorry for the crazy scrolling. We've got a bunch of questions that are, I swear there was, someone that talked about that we're still learning and we don't know. Maybe it was right. Yeah, here we go. We're still figuring this out. So all of these questions still need to be figured out. But yeah, super cool. I'm super excited. Yes, let me go back to our message board here. So yeah, suspense is moving forward. I'm so excited for it. Woo! So it's basically how having a janky loader experience for those with fast enough internet connection, but people with slow internet connection still might get the janky experience. It's not. It's a good question. I guess they could still have the janky experience, but they're gonna have a better experience than just staring at a loading indicator for 5 seconds, right? So it's about simply handling all of your use cases right out of the box. So fast internet connection, users with slow internet connection. I'm currently writing a blog post that I mentioned a couple more. Nested component fetches, or nested components fetching data, multiple calls in a single component, multiple calls in multiple components. There's a lot of scenarios that we have to solve manually right now that concurrent mode is going to solve really easily for us. Yeah, it's about perceived jank. Exactly. Sebastian asks, is that a Lambda hat? Yep. Woo! This was the hat that everybody got at the retreat last year. So I don't know if any of you are not Lambda students. It's quite possible that you're not. But I teach React at Lambda. Definitely check us out. It's an amazing company. Lambda School. I can't talk too much more because my voice is going. But yeah, check out lambdaschool.com. We're doing really awesome things. 9-month program to learn how to code, and the best part is you don't pay a cent until you get a high-paying job. So you don't pay us for your education until it proves successful for you. Thanks. Okay, we're going to go ahead and call it a night. Have a wonderful evening, and yeah, please subscribe because we're going to go through some of those other things that we just looked at a little bit later. But yeah, I will see you all later.